Hi, I'm Mitch Gallagher. Welcome to the Sweetwater Minute. We have a special guest with us here today. This is Alex Lifeson. Great to see you.
It's great to see you too.
So happy to have you visit us here at Sweetwater.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So I have to say, I've had many guitar players sitting across from me. I think you are the first one who's ever come in who had his own chord. The Lifeson chord. You know, Hendrix had one, but obviously he hasn't sat across from me on the. So you're the unique individual with your own chord.
Oh, I'm honored.
Yeah. So you're here talking today about your signature amplifier,
Right. Yep.
which you're doing in conjunction with Mojotone.
Correct.
And we want to take a good firm tour of all the details of the amplifier
Sure.
as well. But tell us what's going on. What's up with you lately? What are you working on?
Well, Rush stopped touring in 2015. I can't believe it's been almost 4 years now since the last show. But I've been pretty active working on other projects, from folk music to industrial to heavy metal and everything in between. And that's been extremely rewarding for me. Been having a lot of fun with it and enjoying it, keeping my fingers limber, playing a lot of acoustic as well lately. We were talking about Eric Johnson earlier.
Right, yeah.
And how he's been playing, he's got a new acoustic record coming out. So that's certainly something that I've been messing around with. And I've been enjoying my time, other than that stuff, just the regular being with my family and reconnecting in a lot of ways after 40 years of being away.
Right. Well, you certainly have earned the chance to sit down and enjoy it.
Yeah,
That's awesome.
I think so too.
And I think we had actually reached the ultimate of guitar player geekery because we were sitting here talking about our fingernails.
That's right.
When you get
time
to
to redo
them. When you get to that point, you know you've gone to the ultimate as far as that stuff goes. So one of the reasons you're here is to talk about the amplifiers. Right. Well, the reason you're here is to talk about the amplifiers. But let's begin by talking a little bit about your concept of tone. What does tone mean to you? And how does it affect what happens to you as a guitar player?
Tone is really what it's all about for, I think, every guitar player. And that kind of underscores the style of that guitarist. It's that connection is always there. If you look at, say, David Gilmour, for example, his tone, when you hear him play, it's David Gilmour, you know right away. And Hendrix was the same way, and Jimmy Page was the same way. And although he had many different sounds, his tone was always very recognizable. The great thing about this amplifier, the Lerxst amp, I worked very closely with Mojotones on it. I've used many amps over the course of 50 years. But we wanted to consolidate everything into one package that had the essence of what I really wanted, from those early amps that were straight in to later, more, say, modern at the time style of amplification. What I really love about the Lerxst is it's the purity of the tone. The dirty channel has all the distortion you need, and it's not overly distorted. It has great sustain. I mean, the last time I used it at home, I played a big E chord. It's still ringing out. And so it has that character to it, beautiful sustain, clarity, but at the same, a nice warm distortion that's not too brittle or crunchy. And the clean setting, for my taste, has all the things that I want. I experienced a lot of amps that I would use for a clean tone that were a little tubby. The bottom end always seemed a little too big. I could never roll it off to the right place where I wanted it. It was either gone or it was like, woo. Right. And what the Lerxst does is it's very even through the low end, the mids, the highs. I really wanted to have a very smooth top end on this amp that was creamy and not brittle. So I think we achieved all those things, and I'm really proud of my association with Mojotones and what we've created, and now of course with Sweetwater and and the growing plans that we have.
Yeah, right. That's awesome. So the amplifier was inspired by an amp that you were using in the studio for Clockwork Angels. Yep. And that amplifier was a pretty limited amp that came out about 1987.
Yep.
Had the silver finish. Had some unique characteristics. What was it that drew you to that amplifier?
Well, typically in the studio, I would bring loads of amps in. I had my own amps that I collected over the years, like all musicians do. But Call Audio, which was a local supplier of vintage equipment for rentals. Really great relationship with them. And Craig would put aside certain amps that he really loved and thought were great sounding amps. And I would always get another 10 or 15 amps. And quite often, you end up using 3 or 4 and the other 30 sort of sit around, but they're there.
Right.
And with Clockwork Angels, I remember being in the studio and we had everything set up. I had all my guitars there. It looked like Sweetwater. There were guitars everywhere, and I just wanted the whole family there for that recording session. And it was the same thing with amplifiers and cabinets and all of that. That amp was an influence certainly, but it's every amp and every amp that I've owned. From that 50-watt Marshall that I rented in the early '70s that I ended up buying, and that amp kind of set me in that 50-watt zone that I really like the tone and the controllability of a lower wattage amp. Years later, when I got into the 100-watt amps, and I used many from high watts to Marshalls to Hughes and Kettners, they're very well. It was the time, so they were loud and they were brittle, and I could never get a warm tone. And you never had a master volume back in those days.
Right. You
just turned the volume up. If you wanted to get distortion, you turned it up, or you put in a distortion pedal or something. And I was never that distortion pedal guy. I liked to have the variety on the guitar, so I'd roll it down to 7 or 6 and play most of my chordal stuff, and then turn it up for the solos and back down again. So when we came to this, there was an influence from a lot of those amps from that session, particularly. But I think we came up with something unique. I wasn't 100% happy with what I was hearing from those amps at that time. But what it did is it put something in my mind that, well, if I had my amp, this is what I would do with these 3 or 4 models of other amps, and what would I take from all of those? Where would I kind of smooth it out? What would I enhance? It was that sort of process to get to where we are with the Lerxst.
Right. And the amps are manufactured for your brand by Mojotone.
Correct.
And what was the connection with them? Were you using their pickups before that, or how did you go about having them make the amp for you?
Yeah, we used, they make a lot of products. So over the years, we did do that. We used components that we got from them. On our last tour, they built some false cabinets that we had as props from the devolution of our stage, from Clockwork Angels to the very first show that we did in a school gymnasium.
Right.
And throughout the course of the show, the staging would change, and other amps would come up designating different periods in our history. So we've had this relationship, and we've worked together on a lot of things. And it seemed only natural to go to them for something like this. That's their specialty. And I really can't tell you how great it has been to work with them. Anything that I've asked for or wanted, or any idea, never seemed too difficult, or certainly not impossible. And they've just done a great job keeping up with that.
Right.
We have, we talk all the time and have plans for other future things. So I'm hoping that we will come up with a few other Lerxst items.
Right. Well, that's exciting.
Yeah.
Exciting to think about that. So the amps have some interesting features, again, inspired by the original, but as you've said, you've tweaked them. 50 watt, 25 watt power, so you can notch it down. It is an EL34 tube driven amplifier. Is that a tube that you gravitate toward, or do you normally go with 6L6s, or do you care?
Totally, I don't care. But that's great that you know that. I couldn't tell you what the difference would be between those tubes or those Soviet tubes or anything. I just know that whatever's in there, I think it is the EL6s.
Those are EL34s.
Or EL34s.
Right, yeah.
34s. I thought there were 35s for a second, but it delivers all the tone that I expect. You know what? I'm going to ask you a question.
Okay.
What is the difference between those two tubes?
The EL34 was used more in the British side of things, a 6L6 is the American tube. You find it more in Fender amplifiers, those kind of
Right.
things. The original
Okay.
Marshalls were all the EL. It's kind of blended. There's a different sound quality.
Sure, there
to
is.
Them, to them, certainly. And some prefer one, some prefer the other. Some don't care.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
As far as that goes, it's just a tone thing, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, that is exactly why I like that tone, because I grew up on that sort of Marshall-y English tone from
and
that
in
period.
that time period, they would have been EL34s through all that. Those early amps.
I learned something.
Well, there you go. We're here to educate on the Sweetwater.
Thank you.
That's what we. So the amp is a dual channel amp with kind of three modes, right? It's got a clean channel, it's got a lead channel, and then there's a rhythm clipping channel as well that can kind of push that clean channel over the edge. Do you use that feature, or do you stick with the two channels?
I like to keep it simple. Those are the two things that I need: a dirty channel and a clean channel, and then I can manipulate attack on the guitar itself. I've had other amps that were 3-channel, and I found that I seldom used the third channel and never really knew what to set up on that third channel. That really was sufficient for me to have those two channels.
One of the nice things about the amp this was based off of, and what you've done with this amplifier as well, is that the EQ is more effective than some of those older vintage style amplifiers, so you can really dial in that clean and dirty.
Yeah.
You can reach in and do you find that a limitation to have to share the EQ with the two channels, or does it work well for you?
No, I think it works okay. Yeah, and I would rather have a clean face on the amp itself rather than two separate dedicated channels with their own EQs. I mean, the EQ range on the amp, I think, is effective, but it's not too extreme. So you get the character of the amp in those two channels. And for me, that works exactly the way I want it to.
Right. One of the hallmarks of this amp is that it does have a great sounding clean channel.
Oh, it does.
Which, some
absolutely.
of the other amps that were based on those British designs don't go that way.
No. I could never find that. And quite often I would have a separate dedicated amp that was just set up to a clean sound, but it was never satisfying for me. I've never had the what I heard in my head for that clean stuff.
Right. The amplifier does have a series effects loop. When you're in the studio, do you use your modulation and delay effects in the loop, or do you apply those afterward during the mix?
A little bit of both, really. Certainly, engineers always want you to process after the fact, but that's because they're engineers and they don't understand that at the front end is where you're getting the sound that you want. That's all part of it. You can't just put delay on or chorusing afterwards and make it an integral part of the sound. It feels like it's plastered on afterwards. That's the way I always felt. And I would get into arguments with all the engineers that we ever worked with in the studio about that. And they would complain, well, you're diluting the purity of the tone. I said, well, this is the sound that I want. I want it to sound like this. Maybe it's a little compressed, or maybe it's this, or maybe it's that. But that's the way I heard it the first time and loved it, and that's the way I want it.
Right.
So for me, it goes either way, really.
Right. So one of the fascinating aspects of what we have set up behind here, for me, are the two cabinets. You've got a 2x12, and you've got actually a 4x12. Now, Mojotone, of course, makes awesome sounding cabinets. They do a wide variety of different things. But let's talk about the 2x12 first. It's an oversized cabinet with creamback 65s in it, which sound a little different than the 75s. Did you specify the speakers you wanted in there, or was that a trial and error kind of thing?
I think we talked about it initially, and whatever they recommended. We were looking at the greenbacks originally, and they have the expertise when it comes to the cabinet design and how it performs, and the best speaker suited for it. So I just really, at the end of the day, left it up to them. I gave them an idea of what I heard in the tonality. I left the electronics expertise and an application, to them, obviously.
Sure, right.
For all the obvious reasons.
Right. Well, with that oversized cabinet you were playing a little bit earlier,
it's huge sound,
doesn't it? It's a big sounding cabinet.
Yeah.
And speaking of big sounding, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, and it's so effective on both the clean and dirty channels. I mean, it sounds warm and creamy, and yet the clarity on the clean channel is all there.
Right.
And you get a sense of dynamics and dimension in the sound.
And even with the large cabinet, you aren't getting a boomy bottom end out of it, which with a clean sound can kind of eat your headroom up and kind of make it balloon, if you will.
Yeah.
The engineer's going to end up cutting all that out anyway.
Yeah.
You know, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it's nicely controlled with that.
Yeah.
It's a big
So if
sound.
you don't have to do that, that's great.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. So speaking of big sound, is where I was going to go was, man, this 4x12 blew me away. When I first walked in and saw these set up, I thought it was a 6x12.
Yeah.
Actually. So is there a story here? Where did this cabinet come from?
Again, we talked about it, and the guys at Mojotones like the idea of going with this size cabinet. Again, keeping a tradition going. I never had the opportunity to use these cabinets live because of the way we ran the system and we had props on stage. And but I love the look of it. I think it's so unique, and it's really cool.
It's got to be the biggest 4x12 kind of going at that point. Talking to Michael from Mojotone earlier, I guess there was a horn originally, kind of in the center.
Yeah, I think it was a keyboard.
And pulled out of there
cabinet.
and kind of almost gives it a port for that extra bottom end. It was really, really fascinating with their great sounding cabinets, certainly. So do you find with an amplifier like this, you've played a wide range of different guitars. You're associated with semi-hollow bodies, of course, Les Pauls, and Paul Reed Smiths, and a lot of single-coil Strat style guitars as well. Is there a particular type of guitar that works well with this amplifier, or do you find it covers the full range for you? I
find it probably leans towards the Gibsons for me. The Les Pauls sound great. The ES series, the 335s, 355s, really sound great. Through this amp. Again, I think because of that quality that they have, the hollow bodies have, that nasally sort of quality, it just translates really nicely through the EQ on these amps. I did a gig not too long ago with a really sweet Cherry 60 335 that I have. And I used my Lerxst combo, and oh my God, it sounded so good.
Right.
Real sweet and distinctive, you know?
Right, right. So speaking of those guitars, one of the things that always fascinated me about your tone was your use of those semi-hollow bodies in the heavier genres of music. What is it that drew you to using those semi-hollow bodies? Because there can be some challenges with those. And with hollow bodies, the Howard Roberts Fusion was one that you used as well.
Yeah, when I first started playing guitar at 12 years old, for my 13th, or for Christmas when I was 13, my parents bought me a Kenora. It was a Japanese kind of Gretsch knockoff. I remember it was $59, and it was red, double cutaway, hollow body. And that was my first electric guitar. And I loved that guitar. I just slept with it. And, you know, I played those same 3 chords all the time on that guitar.
Right.
And I still have that guitar.
Nice.
And so I think, you know, I looked at other guitar players of the period being that young. You know, the Monkees was on TV in that era, and I saw Mike Nesmith play, you know, the hollow body Gretches. Jorma Kekkonen was one of my favorite guitar players earlier on, and he used a 335. Alvin Lee used a 330. Right. So I kind of gravitated to that because it was first the guitar players that I admired were using it, but also it wasn't the typical heavy hard rock guitar. The Les Paul or the Strat was really that instrument. So it made me feel like I was a little bit different, and my style would be a little bit different. And of course, this is a 15-year-old or a 14-year-old kid, you know, thinking big.
Right. Yeah.
But I stuck with that. And the first, you know, good guitar I got was a 335, and you know, played through that whole period in the sort of early 70s. At the club dates, you know, I only had the one guitar, but I was, you know, I got so used to it. And when I had the opportunity to expand my guitar collection, the first thing I got was the 355, the iconic 355, right. And I got a 345, a black 345 at the same time. I ordered them at Gibson in Kalamazoo and went to the factory and picked them up and picked them out and did the whole thing. And the white one was custom built for me at the time, so I felt it was that much more special. Right. And in fact, the original double neck was from that era as well, 1976.
Right. Yeah, great guitars. I assume in those days that the volume levels on stage were fairly high, but you were playing the Howard Roberts Fusion, which was a hollow body guitar. Did you have problems with feedback, or how did you manage that?
The Howard Roberts Fusion wasn't too bad. Of all of them, it was the most controllable. I always kept after a while, I kept my stage volume at a much more moderate level. We always felt that if we could just keep up with the drums, then that was enough, rather than screaming loud amps coming off both sides of the stage.
Okay.
Geddy had switched to direct years and years and years ago, so he no longer had any amps on stage. So as we evolved, it became important to us to keep, when we got rid of the side fills and the wedges, we had no monitors. There was none of this crazy melange of sound all over the stage. We wanted to be able to control it through the PA so that everything was a cleaner, more powerful sound. And we worked a long time to achieve that. So my stage volume became less and less and less. Once we hit the 80s, less and less and less. And I used amps that were a little less powered and were much more controllable.
Right. So I assume then that you were going to in-ears as you move forward, and did that change how you monitored things? Because sometimes players miss that visceral kick in the stomach from the our pants flapping in the
I
volume.
think we went in-ears in 1994. Geddy did it first for the obvious reasons, just so that he could pitch better. And then eventually Neil and I went to them, I think probably a year later or something. And at first I hated it. It felt so uncomfortable. I missed the ambience of the room and the crowd. You finish a song and you hear, and it's disconcerting at first.
Right.
For a while, I would pop one out and just leave one in, but it defeated the purpose of having them. I think as the technology evolved and those in-ears became much better sounding, my mix was always a very natural mix. I had everything in my mix. I had the full kit. I split my guitar. I put a short delay so that I could put it on either side, so the center information would stay clear, and I wouldn't interfere with that, but I would be able to hear the guitar on both sides. So it was very much like a live performance or a live studio performance. And I had mics set up that were room mics, so that when the song ended, the gates would release and I could hear the crowd.
Sure.
So it gave me a little more of that vibe that I was missing. I listened to Ged's mix one time, and it was, I don't know how he could work with it, but I know why he had it that way.
Right.
Lots of bass, lots of vocal, kick, hi-hat, snare, very little of the other drums, keyboards, and he had me direct guitar on a direct line. So there were no effects, none of my effects, none of the stuff that I do, just this dinky guitar sound. But he needed that for his pitch. I talked to him about it. I said, how do you listen to that every night? He said, well, I'm so used to it, and this is exactly what I need to be able to perform the best. And Neil's mix was just drums. He had a hint of guitar, a hint of bass, a little bit of vocals.
Right.
But Neil was the type of guy that knew his parts and played his parts. It wasn't, I'm into the vibe of the band. He knew his parts so well, and he basically played his parts. And that's all he needed to be able to hear all his drums to perform that way.
Right.
Very interesting how different those mixes are.
Yeah. Everyone has to optimize it for their
Yeah,
performing.
I needed a mix that was vibey. I didn't care about the accuracy that in-ears brings so much. I wanted to protect my ears, so I wasn't blowing them out with a side fill or a very bright wedge. So I could moderate that volume level and create an environment that was very much like a live show. And that would vibe me up, and I could be excited about it and feel like I'm not giving anything up.
Right. Did you have any live cabinets on stage?
Here and there we did, but in the later tours, as we progressed to more of a production, less so. And I lamented it at times when when I had the cabinets, I could just go back, get some feedback when I wanted. Standing in front of stacks always was a pretty cool vibe, you know,
Sure.
that you know, goes right back to the very beginning. And it was a bit of a compromise to go to props that were on stage and not amplifiers. Hence that we had the pit, but it was glorious down in the pit.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, out front as well. I mean, I've seen many of your shows, and the sound was always great out front.
Yeah,
And
but
that's a
I mean, in the
testament
pit,
to-
it looked amazing.
I'm sure. Yeah, right,
Yeah,
right.
Just
Everything stacked
stacks
up.
of these. And, yeah.
And all the guitars and,
Yeah,
and everything else. Yeah,
exactly.
you just move in, right?
Yeah.
You don't want to leave, right? So one of the things that interested me is, and maybe a lot of people don't know this, is you've actually used a Telecaster quite a bit.
Yeah.
Through the years, both in recording and for your songwriting. What is the attraction there, and how did you implement that in your recordings?
You know, I had a Strat as a backup guitar in the late 70s, but I seldom used it. I really stuck with the 335 and the 355. We did a gig with Blue Oyster Cult at the NASA Coliseum, and one of the horns off the PA had vibrated off and fallen on the stage and fallen over on my guitars. That's how that guitar got the chip in the headstock.
Yeah.
And
thinking
then
about
it
that.
fell over. It actually fell over onto my 335 and gouged the neck. And so that I retired that guitar, and I didn't bring it back until I think 2012 or something. Before I used it again live. I did not want it to get hurt again.
Right.
So I had that Strat. And because it was such a different sounding guitar, I ended up putting some humbuckers in it. And I did it myself. There's some great photographs from when we were touring in England with the soldering iron in this little dingy dressing room,
Right.
doing this mod on my guitar. And I started to use it more, and that sort of led to the Sportscaster, the Hentor, that we named it that, which was exactly the same thing. It was the humbucker with the two Fender pickups, so that I could have that clarity, but I could have a nice thick, warm sound. The Tele is, I think it's a 51 reissue or 56 reissue, and I got it in 1981. I had an SG that I couldn't stand. The neck felt like I was playing it like this, and it was top heavy, and it was an uncomfortable guitar for me to play. Great guitar, but not for me. So I traded it in at a music store that I dealt with at the time, music shop, for that Tele, and took the finish off the neck, so it's down to bare wood. Really felt super comfortable. I felt really attached to the vibration of the neck. And that became my main guitar for songwriting. I've probably written 80% of my contribution to our Rush music on that guitar from that period on.
Right.
Yeah, it's, when you sit down to write, it's just the way it sits. It feels so comfortable, and then the neck is there, and you play some of the other guitars, like a Les Paul, kind of moves around a little bit, and when you're sitting with the 335, they kind of move around, but the Tele just sits there and makes a solid platform to work on. So it's comfortable in many ways that I don't have to think about it.
Right. Do you find that when you write something on a Telecaster, then when you try and play that on a Les Paul or the 355, does it change just because of the feel of the instrument?
I think when you're writing, you're not really thinking about the sound so much. And typically, Gad and I, when we started out, we wrote on acoustic. He played his bass parts on an acoustic guitar, and I played acoustic for all those, the Necromancer and all those crazy songs.
Sure.
On acoustic. And then once we got in the studio, we played on electrics.
Right.
So that's never been a concern or an issue for me. It wasn't about the tonality of the guitar when we were writing the parts. I knew that one of the other guitars will work, or a particular guitar will work for that song. What I did do with the Tele quite often was if I split the sound, if I just basic double track, I would do a Gibson and that Tele. And that would give me the clarity from that side, the Telecaster, but the balls from the Gibson side.
Right. So what is the key to, through all the albums, the 20-some albums that you've recorded and all of the music, you still have an identifiable tone despite the different periods that you've gone through. What is the key to establishing your own tone as a player?
I think it's here. You know, it's a very difficult question for me to answer because when you're inside, you can't really see it. Evolution is a slow process, and I've been playing for over 50 years, and I can't tell you what my style is like. I know I have certain things that I do. I have a certain type of vibrato that I have a natural vibrato, and and those sort of things. But I can't tell you how different I am from this guy or this guy or this guy or this guy. I think the interesting thing is you can stick any amp and any guitar with an iconic guitarist, for example, and they'll always sound like they sound.
Right.
And with other sort of amateur guitar players, or, you know, it's not the case, you know. And so there's something to be said about professionalism, being a professional at whatever craft you do, whether it's sports or music or engineering or whatever. If you're really good and if you're really stand out in your field, you have that identity, and it's very specific to you. So I got to think that it mostly comes from this hand.
Right, right. You've, through the years, played a lot of different styles within the genre that you work in. There's nylon string classical guitar, there's steel string, there's various electrics, and all the different tones and things you've used. How much do you have to split your attention to maintain all those different things at a performance level?
Yeah, that's a great question. In the last 4 years, as I said, I've been doing these other projects, and what's challenging and what's so attractive to me about those projects is, when someone asks me to play on their record, I think they think that they're going to get Alex Lifeson, who played that part on that record. And what I like to do is to completely disappoint them and do something that they would never expect.
Right.
So I like to come out of left field on the stuff that I do. And that's really a lot of fun for me. A lot of stuff now that I'm doing, I'm manipulating the guitar sound so it doesn't sound like a guitar. Sometimes it sounds like a brass instrument, and sometimes it sounds like a stringed violin, or sometimes it's just a rhythmic noise. And you can, there's so many ways you can process sound to create those sort of things. The one thing I have noticed is I tend to gravitate to playing acoustic a lot lately on a lot of the projects that I get. I got a request from Nick Beggs and Mute Gods. So I've been working with Marco Miniman on a few things. Marco's a fabulous drummer, but he's also a really good bass player. He's a great guitarist, and he sings. Very, very talented musician. And the work that we've been doing together has been really natural and organic. We send very, very basic stems to each other and build up back and forth, and it just keeps building and building. We have a little collective now. We have other musicians that come in and sing, and bass players and things like that. So this Nick Begg project came for one particular song, then Marco played on it. They wanted me to play guitar on it. And I listened to it and I thought, the guitar on here already is awesome. And there's no way that I would do anything different. It would just be me playing what's already on there. Right. So I sat in my home studio and I listened to the track over and over and over again. And, I caught my mandola out of the corner of my eye, and I thought, well, maybe I'll do that. Maybe I'll create this whole other texture in the chorus that comes in and just lifts the track in service of the track. That's what it is all about. It has to, you're not some, big shot schmo that's doing a thing on a song. You're there to service the song and make it better for whoever you're doing that for. So I layered about, 8 tracks of this really rich kind of mandola sound. And I sent it to Nick, and he said, I never would have thought of this. He said, it's so great. We're now taking it and we're creating an intro for the song using your whole mandola piece. And that's what they ended up doing. So the song intros with that, and then it's in the choruses as well.
Right.
And that was so satisfying, gratifying for me to know that I did something that made the song better in their eyes.
Right.
So that's always my goal with those sort of projects.
Right. That's great. That's awesome. Just a couple more questions for you. The last few tours, you were, certainly the last tour, you were talking about doing the de-evolution, if you will, back toward the early days. Did you ever go back and, as you're relearning those songs, discover things, or say, who was that guy that played this stuff, or what was it that jumped out to you about those earlier songs?
There's a trick, I think, and it comes with experience, and that is, how do you make something simple sound really complicated and difficult? And, I think as a musician, you're a musician, you know this, you hear something on the radio, you process it in a different way. It's very difficult to listen to music, I think, when you're a touring musician and you've really devoted your life to being a professional musician. You get very analytical. When I hear a song on the radio, I hear, oh, that's D, that's this, and I see what I know exactly where they're going to go, like this sort of thing. It takes a little bit of the joy out of it, but at the same time, it gives you a keener sense of musical structure and things like that. And what I notice when I go back is from a guitar standpoint, how I always tried to make simple guitar parts sound more difficult. And I always really liked that when I heard it in somebody else. Right. And quite often if I tried to play someone else's song, I think, how did he play that? And then you sit down and you play it and you go, oh my God, this song is 4 chords. Right. What did that guitarist do to this song to make it sound like it's not 4 chords? And that sort of led me to the suspended chords and open strings and creating more than one guitarist in a 3-piece. So that's the kind of stuff that I hear when I go back, and I think, oh my God, I really fooled people with that one.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So when I have someone who plays on your level, performs on your level, has such a long legacy and has worked with so many, well, obviously the 2 amazing musicians and encountered many others, I always have to ask, what is it that makes a great musician?
Passion, first of all, I think. Dedication, intelligence. I think you have to be smart about what you do. Perseverance. You got to be willing to give up a lot of stuff and struggle and maybe not get to where you want to go. Right. But I think essentially, if you have the passion, that'll service you the best. You'll always be happy in your heart for what you do. Right.
Awesome. That's awesome. So I guess the last thing I'll say is that I'm really hoping for a reunion in 2112.
We'll see about that.
I think it'd be awesome.
That's not very far away.
No, it's just around the corner. Alex, thanks so much for taking time to sit down with us today. It's a pleasure to meet
Mitch.
you.
Really enjoyed it.
Really excited about the amps. We're glad to have you on board here as part of the Sweetwater family.
I'm delighted as well.
And we hope you come back soon.
Thank you. I will.
Great to see you. Thanks again.
Thanks.
And thank you for joining me for the Sweetwater Minute. I'm Mitch Gallagher.